would certainly also have awoken a little later without being disturbed, for he had not recovered sufficiently and felt well rested. But it seemed for him that fleeting footsteps and a cautious closing of the door to the hallway had awoken him. Here and there, the glow from the electric streetlight lay pallidly on the ceiling and the upper parts of the furniture. But down by Gregor it was dark. He slowly pushed himself towards the door, still searching around awkwardly with his feelers, which he had only now learning to appreciate, to see what had happened there. His left side seemed to be a single long, unpleasantly tense scar, and he actually had to limp on his 2 rows of legs. One little leg had also been badly injured during the course of the morning's events. It was almost a miracle that only one had been injured and dragged behind lifelessly. Only at the door did he realize what had actually lured him there. He had been the spell of something edible, for there stood a bowl filled with sweet milk in which small pieces of white bread were swimming. He could have laughed with joy, for he had even hungrier than he had been in the morning, and he quickly plunged his head into the milk, almost covering his eyes. But he soon pulled it back in disappointment. Not only was eating causing difficulties due to his sensitive left side, and he could only eat when his entire body collaborated, puffing and panting, but the milk, which was usually his favorite drink, and which his sister had certainly brought him for that reason, didn't taste good, so he turned away from the bowl almost with reluctance and crept back to the center of the room. In the living room, the gas was lit, as Gregor saw through the crack in the door, but although his father usually read it after afternoon paper at this time of day in a raised voice of his mother, and sometimes also to his sister, not a sound was now to be heard. Well, perhaps this habit of reading aloud, which his sister had always told and written him about, wasn't even practiced anymore of late. But it was also so quiet all around, despite the apartment certainly not being empty. What a quiet life his family lived, after all, said Gregor to himself, and felt, and he stared before him into the darkness, great pride that he had been able to provide such a life in such a fine apartment for his parents and sister. But what if all the peace, all the ambience, all of the contentment were now to come to a dreadful end, to keep from losing himself in such thoughts? Gregor instead set himself in motion and began crawling up and down the room. Once during the long evening, one of the side doors was open, and once the other door was opened, a small crack quickly closed again. Someone must have felt the need to come in, but had too many reservations after all. So Gregor began, stopping directly in front of the living room door, determined to bring the hesitant visitor in somehow, or at least to find out who Despite his back being slightly squashed and despite no longer being able to raise his head, he immediately felt very comfortable and only regretted that his body was too wide to be entirely accommodated under the sofa. He remained there the entire night, which he spent partially in a half sleep, from which hunger had repeatedly awoke himself, and partially in a state of worry and a vague hope, which all led to the conclusion that he must behave calmly for the time being, and though through patience and the greatest consideration make the inconvenience which he was forced to cause in his present state as bearable as possible for his family. Early in the morning, it was almost still night. Gregor already had the opportunity to test the strength of the resolution he had just made for his sister, opened the door from the hallway, almost completely dressed, and looked inside with suspense. She didn't find him right away, but when she noticed him under the sofa, good heavens, he had to be somewhere after all. He couldn't have flown away. She was so startled that she, unable to restrain herself, slammed the door again from outside. But then, as though regretting her behavior, she immediately opened the door again, and as though she were visiting one who was critically ill, or even a stranger, entered the room on the tips of her toes. Gregor had pushed his head forward just to the edge of the sofa and was observing her. Would she noticed that he had left the milk untouched, and that it was due to no way of lack of hunger, and would she bring him a different dish that suited him better? If she didn't do it on her own, she would have rather starve than call her attention to it, although he actually felt an immense urge to shoot out from beneath the sofa, throw himself at his sister's feet, and beg for something good to eat. But his sister noticed at once, with astonishment, that the bowl was still full, with just a little milk spilled around it. She picked it up right away, not with her bare hands, of course, but with a wash rag, and carried it out. Gregor was incredibly curious to see what she would do, what she would bring. Instead, it made all kinds of speculations about it, but he never could have guessed what his sister, in all her kindness, really had done. She brought him, in order to try out his taste, an entire assortment, everything spread out in an old newspaper. There were old, half-rotten vegetables, bones from supper, that were covered in hardened white sauce, and a few raisins and almonds. A cheese that Gregor had declared inedible 2 days before, one piece of dry bread, one piece of buttered bread, and one piece of bread that had been buttered and salted. In addition, she also put down the bowl, which was probably now reserved for Gregor, once and for all, and which she had filled with water, and out of sensitivity, for she knew Gregor would not eat in front of her, she departed as quickly as possible, and even turned the key in the door, so Gregor could understand that he could make himself as comfortable as he wanted. Gregor's little legs whizzed as he now went to eat. His wounds, for that matter, must have already staring with satisfaction. He consumed the cheese, the vegetables, and the sauce. The fresh foods, on the other hand, didn't taste good to him at all. He couldn't tolerate their smell at all, and even dragged the things that he wanted to eat a little farther away. He was long since finished with everything and was lying lazily in the same place when his sister slowly turned the key to signal that he should withdraw. This startled him immediately, although he was already almost dozing, and he hurried back under the sofa. But it cost him a great amount of willpower to stay under the sofa, even if only for the short time during which his sister was in the room, for his body was slightly rounded from the ample meal, and he could hardly breathe in the tight space between brief bouts of suffocation. He watched with somewhat protruding eyes as his unsuspecting sister crept together, not only the leftovers but also the food that Gregor had not touched, as though it too were no longer of any use, and how she hastily poured everything into a bucket that she closed with a wooden lid and carried everything out. Hardly had she turned around when Gregor had already pulled himself out from under the sofa and stretched and puffed himself up. Gregor now received his meals in this manner every day. Once in the morning, while his parents and the maid were still sleeping. The second time after the common lunch, for when his parents would also sleep for a little while, and his sister would send the maid away on some errand. Surely they didn't want Gregor to starve either, but perhaps they could not have endured learning more about his food than through hearsay. Perhaps his sister wanted to spare them even a possibly small amount of grief, for they were truly suffering enough at the moment, with which excuses they had managed to get to the doctor and the locksmith out of the apartment on that first morning. Gregor could not find out, because due to the fact that he could not be understood, no one, including his sister, thought that he could understand the others, and so he had to be satisfied with listening to his sister's occasional sighs and appeals to the saints when she was in his room. It wasn't until later, when she had grown somewhat accustomed to everything, it was, of course, impossible to speak of becoming entirely accustomed. Gregor sometimes caught a comment that was meant kindly or could be interpreted as such. He certainly liked his food today, she said when Gregor had cleaned his plate diligently, while in the opposite case, which had gradually become increasingly frequent, she was accustomed to almost sadly saying, "Now it's all been left again." Although Gregor could not learn any news directly, he heard many things from the adjoining rooms, and as soon as he heard even just one voice, he would run directly to the relevant door and push himself with his entire body against it. Especially in the early days, there was no conversation that to stay home alone, and there was no way that they could all leave the apartment together. Already on the first day, the maid had begged his mother on her knees to be immediately dismissed. It wasn't quite clear what and how much she knew about what had occurred, and when she took her leave 15 minutes later, she thanked them in tears for her dismissal, as though for the greatest of good deeds that had been bestowed upon her here. And although no one had demanded it of her, gave a dreadful oath to never betray even the smallest detail to anyone. Now his sister, together with his mother, also had to do the cooking. That wasn't much trouble, however, because they ate hardly anything. Again and again, Gregor could hear one of them encouraging another in vain to eat, receiving no other answer than, "Thank you, I've had enough," or something similar. Perhaps they didn't drink anything either. His sister often asked his father if he would like a beer, and affectionately offered to get it herself. And when he remained silent, she then said to remove any reservations, that she could send the caretaker to fetch it. But then his father finally uttered a big no, and it was not spoken of again. Already during the course of the first day, his father had presented their entire financial situation and process to his mother as well as his sister. From time to time, he rose from the table and removed some document or notebook from his little home safe, which he had salvaged from the collapse of his business 5 years ago. One could hear how he opened the complicated lock and followed the removal of what he had been looking for, locked it again. These explanations by his father were in part the most pleasant news that Gregor had heard since his captivity. He had believed that his father's business had left him with nothing at all. At least his father had told him nothing to the contrary, and Gregor had admittedly never asked him about it. Then Gregor's only concern had been to do his utmost to enable his family to quickly forget the financial misfortune that he had driven everyone to a state of complete hopelessness. He had therefore begun to work with particular zeal, and almost overnight the little clerk had turned into a traveling salesman who had entirely different possibilities to earn money, of course, and whose business successes could be transformed immediately as commissions into cash that could be laid on the table at home before his amazed and delighted family. Those had been good times, and never had a day reoccurred thereafter, at least not in this glory, although Gregor had later earned so much money that he was able to carry the expenditures of his entire family, and also did so. They had simply become accustomed to it. The family as well as Gregor. They took the money his sister had still remained close to Gregor, and it was his secret plan to send her, who, unlike Gregor, loved music deeply and could play the violin movingly, to the conservatory next year, regardless of the great expense that it would entail, which he would have to earn in some other way during his brief stays in the city. The conservatory was often mentioned in conversations with his sister, but always only as a beautiful dream whose realization was unthinkable. Their parents didn't even like to hear these innocent references, but Gregor had thought about it quite distinctively and intended to announce it ceremoniously on Christmas Eve. Such thoughts, entirely useless in his present state, went through his head while he was stuck there upright against the door, eavesdropping. Sometimes he couldn't even listen any further due to general tiredness, and he carelessly let his head bump against the door, but immediately held it firmly against, for even the slightest noise that he had made was heard next door and made everyone fall silent. "What's he up to now, I wonder?" said his father after a while, apparently facing the door, and only then did they gradually continue their interrupted conversation. Gregor was Gregor was well enough informed now, for his father was in the habit of repeating his explanation often, partly because he had not dealt with these matters himself for a long time now, and partly because his mother had not understood everything the first time, that despite all misfortune, some assets still existed from the old days, which had grown slightly in the meantime due to the untouched interest, and furthermore, the money that Gregor had brought home every month he had only kept a small amount for himself, had not been used up entirely, and had accumulated into a small amount of capital. Gregor behind his door nodded eagerly, delighted at his unexpected foresight and thrift. Of course, he actually could have used these excess funds to further pay off his father's debt to his boss, and that day, when he would have been rid of his position, would have been much closer. But now it was undoubtedly better the way his father had arranged things. This money, however, was by no means enough for his family to be able to live on its interest. It was maybe enough to support his family for 1 or 2 years at most, but not more than that, so it was merely an amount that was actually not to be touched, and that had to be saved for emergencies, but the money lived to live on had to be earned. Now, although his father was a healthy man, he was also an old man who hadn't worked at all for 5 years, and in any event would not consider himself to be capable of very such. He had gained a lot of weight, and these last 5 years, which had been the first holiday of his arduous yet unsuccessful life, and had therefore become quite sluggish, and was his old mother now to earn money, she who suffered from was his sister to earn money. She, who was still a child of 17 years of age and was so happily granted a lifestyle that up until now had consisted of dressing herself nicely, sleeping late, helping out in the household, joining in a few humble pleasures, and above all, playing the violin. When the conversation arrived at the necessity to earn money, Gregor always let go of the door first and flung himself on the cool leather sofa next to it, for he had quite fought with humiliation and grief. Often he lay there the whole long night through, not sleeping a wink and only scrambling for hours on the leather. Or he did not shy away from the great effort of moving an armchair to the window, crawling up to the window sill, and popped up in the armchair, leaning himself against the window, apparently only as some sort of remembrance of the liberating sensation he used to feel when gazing out the window. For in fact, he was beginning to see even things that were only a small distance away less clearly by the day. He could no longer catch sight of the hospital on the opposite side of the street, the all too frequent sight of which he had previously cursed, and had he not known for sure that he lived in the quiet but entirely urban Charleston, he could have thought he was gazing out of his window at a desolate landscape in which the grey sky and grey earth merged indistinguishably. Only twice had it his attention. The sister needed to see that the armchair was by the window before she began pushing the armchair right back over to the window each time she had cleaned up his room, and from now on she even left the inner window sash open. If only Gregor had been able to speak to his sister and thank her for everything she had to do for him, he could have endured her services more easily, but as it was, he suffered because of it. His sister certainly tried her best to erase the awkwardness of the whole thing, and the more time passed, the more she succeeded at it, of course. But Gregor only came to see through everything much more clearly with time. Already her entrance was terrible for him. Hardly had she entered than she ran straight to the window without taking her time to close the doors. However careful she usually was to spare everyone the sight of Gregor's room, and tore it open with hasty hands as though she were almost suffocating, and stayed at the window for a little while, even on the coldest of days, breathing deeply. She alarmed Gregor twice daily with her running and clambering. He trembled all the while under the sofa, knowing quite well that she would have certainly have spared him all this commotion if it had been at all possible for her to be in the same room as Gregor with the window shut. Once, A month must have already passed since Gregor's transformation, and his sister no longer had particular reason to be astonished at Gregor's appearance. She came a little earlier than usual and found Gregor motionless and prompt. All right, quite frighteningly, still gazing out the window. It would not have been unexpected for Gregor if she had not entered, for in his possession he prevented her from opening the window straight away. But not only did she not enter, she even shrank back and closed the door. A stranger could almost have thought that Gregor had been lying in wait for her and had wanted to bite her. Of course, Gregor hid himself immediately under the sofa, but he had to wait until midday before his sister returned, and she seemed much more anxious than usual. He concluded from this that the sight of him was still unbearable to her and was certain to remain unbearable, and that it must require great strength for her to keep from running away at the sight of even the small part of his body that protruded from beneath the sofa. One day, in order to spare her the sight as well, he carried the linen cloth from the sofa on his back. He needed 4 hours for this task and arranged it in such a way that he was now completely covered and his sister could not see him even if she had bent down. If she had considered the linen cloth to be unnecessary, she could have removed it after all, for it was clear enough that Gregor did not find amusement in entirely closing himself off in this way. But she left the linen cloth where it was, and Gregor even believed to have caught a grateful glance once as he carefully lifted the cloth a little to see how his sister found the new arrangement. During the first 2 weeks, his parents could not bring themselves to come into his room, and he often heard how they gave his sister complete recognition for the work she was doing, whereas before they had often been irritated by her, for she seemed to them to be somewhat useless girl. Now, however, both his father and mother waited in front of Gregor's room while his sister cleaned it up, and hardly had she come out, even she had to tell them exactly how the room looked, what Gregor had eaten, how he had behaved this time, and if perhaps a slight improvement could be observed. His mother, incidentally, had wanted to visit Gregor relatively soon, but his father and sister had initially held her back with rational arguments which Gregor had listened to quite attentively and approved of fully. But later on, she had to be held back by force, and when she then cried, "Let me see Gregor. After all, he is my poor son. Can't you understand that I must see him?" Then Gregor thought that it might be good after all if his mother came inside. Not every day, of course, but perhaps once a week. She understood everything much better than his sister, who, despite all her efforts, least amount of pleasure. So for diversion, he developed the habit of crawling to and fro across the walls and ceiling. He was particularly fond of hanging from the ceiling. It was much different than lying on the floor. One could breathe more freely. A slight swaying passed through one's body, and in the state of almost happy diversion in which Gregor found himself up there, it could happen that to his own surprise he would let go and crash to the ground. But now, of course, he had more control over his body than before and didn't hurt himself even during such a big fall. His sister noticed at once the new form of amusement that Gregor had found for himself. After all, he also left his sickly traces here and there as he crawled, and she set her mind to allowing Gregor the largest amount of crawling space possible by removing the furniture that was hindering him, particularly the chest and the desk. But she was not able to do this on her own. She didn't dare to ask her father for help. The housemaid would certainly not have helped her, for although the girl of about 16 had been holding out bravely since their previous cook's resignation, she had requested the privilege of being allowed to keep the kitchen door constantly locked and only having to open it when she specifically asked to do so. So his sister had no other choice than to fetch his mother once during his father's absence. And with cries of excited joy, his mother did approach, only to fall silent at the door to Gregor's room. First, his sisters looked to see if everything was in order in the room. Only then did she let her mother enter. With the greatest haste, Gregor had pulled the linen cloth even further down, with more folds, and the whole thing really looked as though a cloth had been casually thrown over the sofa. Gregor refrained from spying from under the linen cloth this time as well. He refrained from seeing his mother this time and was happy that she had come after all. "Come on, you can't see him," said his sister, apparently leading his mother by the hand. Gregor then heard how the two weak women moved the old but heavy chest from its place, and how his sister consistently took most of the work upon herself without listening to the warnings of her mother, who was afraid she was going to overexert herself. It took a long time. Already after a quarter hour's work, his mother said they should just leave the chest there. First of all, it was too heavy. They wouldn't be finished by the time his father returned, and with the chest in the middle of the room, Gregor's every movement would be blocked. And second, it was not at all certain that it seemed to her that the opposite was true. The sight of the empty watch really weighed upon her heart. And why should Gregor feel the same, since he had been accustomed to the furniture for so long, and would therefore feel abandoned in an empty room? And is it not the case, concluded his mother very quietly, almost in a whisper, as if she wished to prevent Gregor, whose exact whereabouts she didn't know, from hearing even the sound of her voice. For she was convinced that he didn't understand her words, and it is not the case that by removing the furniture we are showing him that we have lost any hope of his recovery and have ruthlessly abandoned him. I think it would be best to try and keep the room in the exact condition that it was before, so that Gregor, when he returns to us, will find everything unchanged and be all the more able to easily forget what happened in the meantime. As he heard his mother's words, Gregor realized that the complete lack of direct human contact during these past 2 months, combined with this monstrous, monotonous life in the midst of his family, must have confused his mind, for there was no other way to explain how he could have seriously wanted his room to be empty. Had he really wanted to have his warm room comfortably equipped with inherited furniture transformed into a cave in which he would surely be able to crawl around unimpededly in all directions, but at the same time quickly and completely forget his human past. Indeed, had he already been closer to forgetting just now, before his mother's voice, which he hadn't heard for a long time, jarred him awake. Nothing was to be removed. Everything had to stay. He could not manage without the positive influence of the future on his condition, and if the furniture was a hindrance for his senseless crawling about, it not only did him no harm, but was also a great advantage. But unfortunately his sister was of a different opinion. When discussing matters related to Gregor with her parents, she had become accustomed to acting as the special expert, which was admittedly not entirely unjustified. So now his mother's advice was also reason enough not only to insist on the removal of the chest and desk, which his sister had initially thought of on her own, but the removal of all furniture, with the exception of the indispensable sofa. Of course, it was not only childish defiance and the self-confidence which she had so unexpectedly and arduously acquired of late that had led her to determine that this course she had actually observed, after all, that Gregor required a lot of room to crawl, whereas it appeared that he did not use the furniture at all. Perhaps a role was also played by the emotion sensibility of girls her age, which seeks gratification at every opportunity, and by which Gred was now letting himself be tempted to make Gregor's situation even more terrifying in order to be able to help him even more than before. For one, a his sister get the chest out. Now, if need be, Gregor could do without the chest, but the desk had to stay, and hardly had the women left the room with the chest on which they pressed themselves. Groaning, then Gregor stuck his head out from under the sofa to see how he could intervene as carefully and considerately as possible. But unfortunately, it had to be his mother who returned first, while Gret held her arms around the chest in the next room and swung it back and forth on her own, without, of course, managing to move it at all. His mother, however, was not accustomed to the sight of Gregor. It could make her ill, and so he anxiously hurried backwards to the other end of the sofa, and was no longer able to avoid making the first of the linen cloth move slightly. The serf sacrificed in getting his mother's attention. She paused, stood still for a moment, and then went back to Gren. Although Gregor told himself repeatedly that nothing unusual was happening after all, that only a few pieces of furniture were being rearranged, he soon had to admit that the women's walking back and forth, their little shouts, the scratching of the furniture on the floor, all affected him like a great tumult flood from all sides, and he inevitably had to admit it to himself that no matter how tightly he pulled his head and legs in and pressed his body down to the floor, he would not be able to stand for much longer. They were clearing out his room, taking everything that was dear to him. They had already carried out the chest in which his fret saw and other tools that were stored. They were now loosening the desk, which had already dug itself firmly into the floor, and at which he had completed his assignments as a business school student, as a secondary school student, and yes, even a primary school boy. He really had no more time to assess the good intentions of the two women, whose existence he had incidentally almost forgotten, for in their exhaustion they were now working in silence, and all that could be heard were the heavy steps of their feet. And so he buzzed out. The women were leaning against the desk in the next room to catch their breath a little, changing his direction 4 times as he ran. He really didn't know what. To say first. When he saw the picture of the lady clad entirely in furs, hanging conspicuously on the otherwise empty wall, he crawled hurriedly up to it and pressed himself against the glass, which held him tight and felt good on his hot abdomen. At least this picture, which Gregor was now covering completely, would certainly not be taken from him. He turned his head toward word, the first words she had spoken directly to him since his transformation. She ran into the next room to fetch some sort of essence with which she could awaken her mother from her unconsciousness. Gregor also wanted to help. There was still time to rescue his picture, but he was stuck fast to the glass and had to tear himself away with force. Then he too ran into the living room as though he could give his sister some kind of advice as he used to in the past, but instead he had to stand idly behind her while she rummaged around in various little bottles, managing to startle her. As she turned around, a bottle fell onto the floor and shattered. A splintered, injured Gregor in his face, and some sort of corrosive medicine flowed around him. Without further delay, Gret then took as many little bottles as she could hold and ran with them to her mother, slamming the door shut with her foot. Gregor was now cut off from his mother, who was perhaps near death because of him. He was not allowed to open the door for fear of chasing away his sister, who had to stay with his mother. He could not do nothing but wait and beset with self-reproach and concern. He began to crawl. He crawled over everything, walls, furniture, and the ceiling. And finally, in his desperation, as the whole room had already begun to spin, he fell onto the middle of the big table. A little while passed as Gregor lay there listlessly. All around him it was quiet. Perhaps that was a good sign. Then the doorbell rang. The maid was locked in the kitchen, of course, so Gret would have to answer it. His father had arrived. What has happened? Were his first words. Gret's appearance must have revealed everything to him. Gret answered with a muffled voice, as she was apparently pressing her face onto her father's breast. Mother was unconscious, but she is already feeling much better. Gregor has escaped. I expected he would, said his father. I always told you he would, after all, but you women didn't want to listen. It was clear to Gregor that his father had interpreted Gret's all too brief report falsely and assumed that Gregor was guilty of committing some act of violence. Gregor therefore had to try and appease his father, for he had neither the time nor the room ability to explain things to him, and so he fled to the door of his room and pressed himself against it so that his father could not see. Right when he entered the hallway, that Gregor had the best intention of returning to his room once, and that there was no need to force him back, for one simply needed to open the door, and he would disappear right away. But his father was not in the mood to notice such subtleties. Aha! He shouted the moment he entered, in a voice that sounded as though he was simultaneously angry and pleased. Gregor withdrew his head from the door and lifted standing there now. Recently, due to his new habit of crawling around, Gregor had neglected to follow the activities in the rest of the apartment as he had done before. Otherwise, he should have actually been prepared to encounter some charged circumstances. Nevertheless, was this still his father? The same man who tirelessly lay buried in his bed as Gregor marched off on a business trip, who had greeted him on the evening of his return in his dressing gown from his armchair, who had not been entirely capable of standing up, but instead had only raised his arms as a sign of his joy, and who during their seldom strolls together on a few Sundays a year and on his high holidays between Gregor and his mother, who were already walking rather slowly, had walked even a little more slowly, wrapped up in his old overcoat, working his way forward with his carefully positioned walking stick, and almost always standing still and gathering his companions around him whenever he wanted to say something. But now he was standing upright quite well, dressed in a close-fitting white uniform and with gold buttons like these worn by the attendants at the banking institutions. His strong double chin unfolded above the high, stiff collar of his coat, his black eyes gazing out blandly and attentively from beneath his baby eyebrows, his white hair, usually disheveled, combined down into a meticulous shining side part. He tossed his cap with its gold monogram, probably that of a bank, in an arch across the entire room onto the sofa, and walked with tails of his long uniform coat thrown behind him and his hands in his pockets towards Gregor with a sullen expression on his face. Perhaps he didn't know himself what he had intended to do. After all, he lifted his feet unusually high. Gregor was amazed at the enormous size of his boot soles, but he did not linger in doing so, for he had known from the first day of his new life that his father believed only the utmost severity to be appropriate in his treatment of Gregor, and so he ran away from his father, paused when his father stopped, and hurried forward again. The movement his father stirred. They were circles around the room several times in this manner, without anything decisive occurring. Indeed, without the entire thing even having the appearance of a pursuit, it was so slow. Gregor, therefore, remained on the floor for the time being, especially because he feared that his father could regard his escape onto the walls or ceiling as particularly mischievous. In any case, Gregor had to tell himself that he would not be able to keep up this running for long, for each of his father's steps required him to carry out a whole host of movements. He had already begun to notice a shortness of breath, just as he had not possessed entirely The small red apples rolled around on the floor and bumped into one another as though electrified. A lightly thrown apple grazed Gregor's back, but slid off harmlessly.